Welcome back, everyone, to the Journeyman Podcast. We're on episode 12 today, and we are diving into a story that's been making waves, both online and in the real world. And if you enjoy these deep dives into all these crazy topics, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. So let's set sail for the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
Or should we say the Gulf of America? Our sources today reveal a clash of perspectives between Google Maps and the Mexican government,
Interesting.
all sparked by a seemingly simple name change.
What's really captivating here is how, a digital map, something we just take for granted,
Right.
has become a battleground for this whole debate over names and authority and, even international relations.
Yeah, it really highlights how something as simple as a name can be so important and influential.
Exactly.
So for our listener, imagine opening up Google Maps and suddenly seeing Gulf of America, where you've always seen, Gulf of Mexico. Turns out Google made this change for users in the United States,
Oh, wow.
citing a U.S. executive order as their justification.
I see.
But here's where the tides get a little choppy. The Mexican government is pushing back pretty hard,
Really?
arguing that the executive order only applies to the U.S. portion of the Gulf, not the whole body of water.
So it's important to understand that the Gulf of Mexico isn't solely U.S. territory, right? Mexico and Cuba also share its waters, which gives them a stake in this whole naming debate.
Right.
So this situation kind of throws Google right into the middle of an international dispute,
Yeah.
forcing them to navigate, these complexities of national regulations versus global sensitivities.
And it's fascinating because one of our sources reveals that Google's policy is to reflect official government names in their mapping data. They point to the U.S. Geographic Names Information System, or GNIS, as the source for this Gulf of America designation.
So basically, from Google's perspective, they're just following the data.
Yeah, that's a key aspect of their stance, this reliance on authoritative databases.
But it begs the question, though, what happens when those databases conflict with international norms or perceptions from other countries? Google in this case becomes the messenger, but the message itself is highly contested.
And it gets even more complicated when you consider that Google Maps actually shows both names.
What?
Yeah, Gulf of Mexico and Gulf of America, for users in some countries.
Oh, wow.
So imagine the confusion this creates.
Yeah.
You're looking at a map, and the name of this major geographical feature keeps changing depending on where you are in the world.
Right. That's wild.
It really is.
So this inconsistency really highlights the challenges of running a global platform in a world where information and perceptions can vary so much.
Right.
Google's trying to be data-driven, but that clashes with the reality that the world isn't always so neatly defined by data points.
Exactly. So we have Google trying to follow their policy, the U.S. government asserting its naming convention, and the Mexican government vehemently disagreeing.
Yeah.
And in the middle of all of this, we have the public just trying to make sense of these conflicting labels on their digital maps.
It's a mess.
It really is.
It really shows how much influence tech giants like Google have in shaping how we understand the world.
For sure.
They often present themselves as neutral platforms,
Right.
but their choices about what to show and how to present it have huge consequences, This brings us to an interesting point, don't you think? It's not just about a name on a map.
Right.
It's about, the power dynamics between countries,
Yeah.
the role of technology in shaping our perceptions, and how these digital platforms can become, battlegrounds for geopolitical disputes.
Absolutely. And the stakes get even higher when you consider the legal battle brewing beneath the surface. Mexico isn't just complaining.
Wow.
They're threatening to take Google to court
Wow.
if the name isn't changed back.
So what's Mexico's argument based on?
Well, their stance is rooted in international waters. The Gulf of Mexico, while partially within U.S. jurisdiction,
Right.
extends beyond those boundaries. So a unilateral down change by one country raises all sorts of questions
Like what?
about, sovereignty
Yeah.
and the right to just dictate what something's called for a shared resource.
I see.
It's kind of like trying to rename your neighbor's swimming pool just because part of it extends into your yard.
Haha, I like that analogy.
Thanks. It raises questions about who gets to decide what things are called and what happens when those decisions clash with international norms.
Yeah, the potential legal ramifications are pretty interesting. Could a U.S. court even have jurisdiction over something involving international waters and a company that operates globally?
That's a good question.
And what happens if Google loses? What kind of precedent does that set for other companies in similar situations?
It's a tough one. It's a real legal quagmire. And the outcome could have a big impact across the tech world.
Absolutely.
But beyond the legal stuff, there's another part to this story, public perception and how Google's trying to manage it.
Okay.
Remember when Google turned off reviews for Gulf of America?
Oh, yeah, after all that negative feedback.
Exactly.
It's a classic example of how these platforms present themselves as neutral, but then try to control things behind the scenes.
Right.
They want to avoid controversy, but they end up creating more of it by trying to silence people.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Totally.
By trying to stay neutral, they end up taking a side, which just highlights how much power they have in shaping online conversations.
Exactly. Their actions, or in this case, an inaction, speak volumes, you know?
Yeah, it makes you think about censorship information control and how these companies try to balance their policies with public pressure.
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure.
So for our listener, think about the last time you searched for something online. Did you ever wonder what information might be missing or how the results were chosen and shown to you?
Yeah, this Gulf of America thing gives us a glimpse into those hidden mechanisms.
It does, and it reminds us that even online, where information seems to flow so freely,
Right.
there are still power dynamics and agendas at play that affect what we see and how we understand the world.
It all comes back to that.
It does. The names we use, the maps we look at, even the data we rely on are all products of choices, interpretations, and even disputes.
It's true. This case really shows us why critical thinking and media literacy are so important. We can't just take everything we see online at face value.
We have to question things, analyze them, and find different perspectives to form our own opinions.
Couldn't agree more. It's especially important now with these tech giants like Google filtering and framing so much of the information we see.
We need to be aware of their influence, understand their motivations, and approach the information they present with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? What could happen with this whole Gulf of America situation?
Well, there are a few possibilities. Mexico could go ahead with their lawsuit, which would be a long and expensive process with no guaranteed outcome.
Yeah.
Or Google, facing, all this pressure and potential diplomatic problems, decides to switch back to Gulf of Mexico.
Right. And there's always the chance of a compromise, right?
Yeah.
Like some sort of dual naming convention that acknowledges both the U.S. name and the international one. Maybe a solution where what you see depends on where you are or what language you're using.
Yeah, that localized approach could be the best way to handle it.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that it's a complicated situation and tries to keep everyone happy.
It really makes you think, what other little discrepancies or hidden conflicts are out there in the digital world?
Right.
Like what other names or labels or bits of information are being argued over or changed without us knowing?
It's a good question, and it shows how important it is to stay informed and think critically about what we see online.
This Gulf of America thing, while seemingly like a small issue, offers valuable lessons about power perception and how technology and the real world are constantly interacting.
And for our listener, I'd encourage you to check out the sources we've linked in the show notes.
Yeah.
They give a lot more detail about the legal arguments, the cultural importance of the Gulf of Mexico, and Google's own policies.
Definitely worth reading if you're interested in learning more about this case. But zooming out a bit, what do you think this whole situation says about the future of online information?
I think it's a warning. As we depend more and more on digital platforms for information, we need to remember that they can become battlegrounds for different narratives, political agendas, and even cultural clashes.
It's almost like a digital Wild West out there with all these groups fighting for control and influence.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And in this digital frontier, it's up to us to become better navigators. We need to think critically, learn to spot bias, and find diverse perspectives to form our own opinions.
So we can't just passively absorb information anymore. We have to actively engage, question, analyze, and even challenge what we see online.
Exactly. The Gulf of America controversy reminds us that names, labels, even maps are not neutral. They have power, they reflect power dynamics, and they can be used to shape how we see the world.
Well said. This has been a really insightful deep dive into a complex issue.
Yeah, it has.
We've explored Google's point of view, looked at the legal and political side of things, and even touched on the bigger picture of information control in our digital age.
And as the world becomes even more connected and technology keeps influencing us, these kinds of debates are only going to become more common.
So listeners, next time you open a map or browse online, remember the Gulf of America. Ask yourself, who created this information, what might be missing, and whose perspective is being represented?
Those are the questions that will help you navigate the digital world with more awareness and make better judgments.
Great advice. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey for today.
It's been a good one.
It really has. Thanks for joining us here on the Journeyman Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Gulf of America, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. We'll be back next time with another fascinating exploration into the world of ideas and information. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those minds sharp.